The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood, ink, and nerves. Dust particles danced in the sunlight, pouring through tall windows. The kind of morning where even silence seemed to weigh heavy in the air. Everyone knew why they were there. This wasn't just another hearing. This was the testimony of Lily Grace Thomas, a 3-year-old who hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since being removed from her home 6 months ago. Her case had rattled Ridgefield, a quiet town where things like this weren't supposed to happen. Not here, not to someone so young. Judge Harding sat upright in his seat, his expression unreadable but watchful. The kind of look a man wears when balancing law with humanity. "Is the witness present?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. From the rear door, the child advocate entered, followed closely by Lily's foster mother, a kind woman, in her 50s, named Denise, and a tiny figure gripping her hand. Lily wore a pink hooded sweatshirt, the hood pulled up despite the warmth of the courtroom. Her free thumb was in her mouth. She moved slowly, like every step through that room. It was a mile. Everyone turned to look. Even the defendant, Thomas Granger, straightened in his seat. Lily didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She was too busy not crying. The prosecution team stood beside their table, watching with hearts quietly breaking. They knew they were on the edge of something rare and fragile. The entire case depended on this child's ability to speak, to remember, to point a finger. Without her words, there wasn't enough to go on. Too little physical evidence, no video. Just suspicion, reports from doctors, and a girl who hadn't spoken a full sentence about what had happened. Until now, she hadn't said a name. Not even a description, just fear. She's scared of men, Denise had explained in an earlier hearing. Even mailmen. She cries when she sees a brown uniform. She'll scream if someone slams a door, but she loves dogs. That had sparked an idea. The prosecutor had made a request, one that had never been tried in this county before. So as Lily stood near the bench, shaking and silent, another door opened quietly. A black and tan German shepherd walked in. Officer Ruiz held the leash, gently. He was a tall, soft-spoken man, former Marine, now part of the department's K9 unit. The dog beside him walked without command, slow, steady, confident. His name was Max. He was wearing a vest but no bark muzzle. He didn't need one. The moment Lily saw him, everything changed. Her thumb slipped out of her mouth. Her head tilted slightly. She stared. Max paused. He looked right at her and sat, just like that. Lily let go of her foster mother's hand. The courtroom didn't breathe. Even Judge Harding leaned forward. One tiny foot moved, then another. Lily walked, slowly, carefully, across the wide floor and stopped a few feet from the dog. She didn't speak. She didn't touch him. She just stood there like he had opened a door no one else had been able to find. Officer Ruiz whispered to the judge, "May I let Max go?" The judge nodded. "Yes, let's see what happens." Ruiz unhooked the leash. Max stayed seated. Lily inched closer, eyes wide but calm. Then, after nearly a minute of silence, she did something no one expected. She pointed at Max. Her arm stretched. Out, small and trembling, 2 words escaped her lips. "Bad man." The room froze. Judge Harding dropped his pen. The prosecutor's jaw clenched. Even the defense attorney lost his polished posture. Thomas Granger, the defendant, visibly stiffened. "Did she just—" someone whispered from the gallery. No one moved. Lily had just done more than speak. She had named someone, without a name, and the key was hanging right around Max's neck. Max didn't flinch as Lily pointed at him and said the 2 haunting words, "Bad man." The room hovered. Between disbelief and electricity, the dog stayed perfectly still, ears forward. His eyes focused on the girl in front of him, as if they shared a language no one else could understand. Lily wasn't crying. That was what shocked Denise the most. Since coming into her care, the little girl had spent most nights curled in a ball, sobbing at shadows. And now, in a courtroom full of strangers, sitting just feet away from the man she feared most, she was calm. And she was talking. Sort of. The judge leaned toward the bench microphone. "Let the record show the witness identified the police K9, Max, and said the phrase, 'Bad man.'" The court reporter's keys clicked like machine gun fire. "Is there any context for that?" Judge Harding asked, peering at the prosecutor. "Believe we're about to get it, Your Honor," said ADA Jenna Morris. Her voice was quiet, her eyes fixed on Lily, who now stepped forward and placed a tiny hand gently on Max's fur. Max leaned in slightly. She touched the tag hanging from his collar, a small silver circle. Lily tilted her head and stared at it for several seconds before looking up again. She pointed at the tag and said, "He." Morris's heart skipped a beat. "Your Honor, may I approach the witness and examine the dog's tag?" "Proceed," the judge said. Morris walked slowly across the courtroom, heart pounding. She knelt by the dog. The tag wasn't an ID, that hung further up the vest. This was something else. It was a photo tag, a small keepsake, laminated and fitted into a metal ring. The picture was simple. Max sitting at attention, Officer Ruiz standing beside him, smiling in his uniform, and just behind them, wearing a Community Hero volunteer shirt and grinning with a hand on Max's back. Thomas Granger. Gasps scattered through the courtroom like dropped glasses. Judge Harding blinked. "What in God's name?" Granger went rigid in his seat. His defense attorney immediately stood. "Objection, this is prejudicial." "Overruled." Harding snapped, the first emotion he'd shown all morning. The judge gestured toward the photo. "Officer Ruiz, step forward." Ruiz approached, already pale. "Sir." "Where and when was this taken?" the judge asked. "That's from a K-9 demonstration we did at Little Steps Daycare, back in February. We bring Max in for school visits. It helps kids learn about safety." Granger signed up as a volunteer for crowd control and snacks. The air in the room turned ice cold. Little Steps Daycare, the same daycare where Lily had been enrolled before the abuse investigation started. The pieces were starting to align. Granger had worked security for 2 months under the radar, listed as a background-cleared volunteer through a now-defunct agency. No one ever thought to tie him to Lily's past, until now. Lily crouched next to Max, stroking his neck slowly, as if grounding herself. Jenna Morris turned back toward the bench. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit the tag as photographic. Evidence and request an immediate recess for forensic review. The child appears to have recognized the individual, not through direct confrontation, but through his image associated with the dog." "Granted," said the judge. "Court is in recess for 1 hour. Officer Ruiz, keep the dog with the witness." Granger stood and leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously. The lawyer looked like he'd just aged 5 years. Lily didn't. Look at Granger. She didn't have to anymore. She had remembered something, and not just something. She had remembered someone, and somehow the memory hadn't come through therapy or drawings or dreams. It had come from a dog's photo tag, and what happened next would tear the case wide open. The courtroom was emptying for recess, but the tension hadn't gone anywhere. The moment the judge's gavel fell, Thomas Granger's attorney was already on the phone, pacing in the hallway like a man watching his house burn down. Officers stood, near him now, not with suspicion, but with silent alertness. Inside the witness room, Lily sat on a small padded bench, with Max curled beside her, his head resting near her leg. Her foster mother, Denise, sat nearby, tears in her eyes as she watched something she'd never thought she'd see. Lily looking calm, not blank, not shut down. Calm Ada. Jenna Morris leaned against the doorframe, notebook in hand. She knew what had just happened was monumental. A child with no prior testimony had just identified her abuser in the most unexpected way imaginable. But it wasn't enough. "Not yet. Can I sit?" she asked gently. Denise nodded. Lily didn't move. Jenna took a breath and knelt down near Max, lowering her tone. "Hi, Lily. I remember you from a while ago. I know people ask you a lot of questions. I won't ask a lot, but I do want to ask just one." Lily's eyes stayed on Max's fur, her little fingers combing through it in soft patterns. "Do you remember the man in the photo?" Jenna asked. Lily nodded. "Do you remember what he did?" A pause, a long one, the kind that makes you hold your breath. Then Lily whispered, barely audible, "Closet." Jenna's chest tightened. "Did something happen in the closet?" she asked gently. Lily nodded again. Her voice was still soft like paper being torn. "He said hide and don't tell." Max shifted, lifting his head. He nuzzled her hand like he knew. Denise's mouth dropped open slightly, tears slipping down her cheek. "She's never said anything that clear. Not to me, not to the social worker, nothing." Jenna stood slowly. "Because she never felt safe until now." She turned to Officer Ruiz. "You're not going anywhere. She talks when he's around. Max stays in that courtroom for the rest of the trial, clear?" Ruiz nodded firmly. Meanwhile, across the hall, the judge sat back in chambers, replaying the moment in his head. "A 3-year-old recognized her abuser from a dog's ID tag," he said aloud to no one in particular, "and identified him with 2 words. "Not just 2, said Morris, stepping in. "She just said more. Said he locked her in a closet, told her not to tell." Harding looked stunned. "That's hearsay," said Granger's lawyer, who had followed her in. "It's testimony." Jenna snapped back. "And it's going on the record. No one reads a 3-year-old's whispers as fact." She recognized his face from a tag. No coaching, no prompting. She said "bad man" before anyone even knew what was on it. And now she's giving specifics. "If you want to call that coincidence, be my guest, but you'll lose." Judge Harding rubbed his forehead. "I'll allow it. You'll need corroboration, but if the child continues to speak, and the details line up, this case will blow wide open." And it would, because while the world outside had no idea what had just happened, inside that courthouse, a silent girl had just said enough to change everything. Jenna Morris walked back into the courtroom, with a single goal: to give that little girl the strength to keep going. And Max, he wasn't just a support animal anymore. He was a witness, a bridge between silence and the truth. By the time court reconvened an hour later, the atmosphere had changed. There was no more chatter, no polite shuffling of papers, no smiles. Everyone. I knew something had shifted. A wall had cracked. Lily returned to the courtroom, this time walking slightly ahead of her foster mother. Max trotted quietly at her side, vest on, tail low and relaxed. The little girl wasn't holding anyone's hand. She walked with her thumb tucked in the pocket of her hoodie instead, jaws clenched as people noticed. The tiniest girl in the room looked braver than half the adults. Judge Harding called the court back to order, his voice more serious than before. "Miss Morris, you may proceed." Jenna Morris stood slowly. "Your Honor, before we proceed with further questioning of the child, the state would like to formally submit this photograph, originally attached to the K9 unit's collar tag, as direct evidence." The image was projected onto a screen. Max in his vest, Officer Ruiz beside him, and behind them, as grinning wide, stood Thomas Granger. He wasn't just in the background. He had his hand on the dog's back, almost like he belonged. Morris walked to the screen and pointed. This photograph was taken during a police outreach event at Little Steps Daycare. The event was held 4 months before the victim was removed from her biological home due to suspected abuse. Mr. Granger was a registered volunteer on site. He had access to the daycare rooms and— "Objection!" Granger's lawyer snapped. "There's no proof he had direct contact with the child." Judge Harding didn't even blink. "Overruled. Continue." Morris turned to Lily, who now sat on a small padded chair in front of the witness box, Max resting quietly at her feet. "Lily," Morris said gently, "do you remember this place?" She pointed to a still shot from the same event, this time showing a bouncy castle, kids, in costumes and the daycare's recognizable blue walls. Lily nodded slowly. "And do you remember the man in this picture?" The girl leaned forward, looking carefully at Granger's face. She didn't speak. Instead, she pointed again, straight at the screen. And then, in a voice just loud enough to echo across the courtroom, she said, "He said we play hide and seek." Morris froze. "He did." Lily nodded, her eyes now narrowing, the way a child recalls something too big for their mind to hold. "In the closet." Lily didn't nod this time. She said, "Dark, no talking, just hiding. He lock it." The court erupted in murmurs. Granger's attorney tried to object again, but the judge raised his hand sharply. "Let the child speak." Morris stepped back slightly, her throat tight. "Did he say not to tell?" Lily looked at her, and for the first time there was something behind her eyes. Not fear, anger. "Bad man say I get lost, or the dog go away." The courtroom froze. Max lifted his head slowly and looked up at her, as if understanding her words. She reached down and ran her hand through his fur again. Jenna Morris whispered under her breath, "Oh my God." Granger, now visibly sweating, tugged at his collar. His attorney whispered something quickly in his ear, but Granger didn't respond. He was watching the child, and she was no longer watching him. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had found something, not in people, not in courts, not in words. But in Max, he had become her lighthouse in the storm, her proof that the dark was behind her. As the judge called for a short adjournment, Officer Ruiz knelt beside Max and looked at the girl. "You okay, kiddo?" Lily gave a small nod. "Max, good." Max licked her hand once. The room was silent, reverent, because in the span of minutes a photograph no one had noticed became the key to unlocking the truth. And that truth was just getting started. The fifth day of the trial began under a grey, spitting sky, the kind of weather that made people walk faster and talk less. Inside the courthouse, however, voices buzzed like hornets. The image of Thomas Granger smiling in the daycare photo had already made its way to local news outlets. Pundits debated its meaning, parents demanded background checks, and anonymous tip lines were lighting up across the county. But back inside courtroom B, Granger's attorney wasn't done yet. "Your Honor," he said, standing confidently as court resumed, "we request a motion to suppress the child's statements. She is 3 years old. Her mind is underdeveloped, and she has clearly been influenced emotionally by the presence of a police animal." He gestured dramatically toward Max, who lay curled near the bench, eyes closed, indifferent to the circus around him. "She doesn't understand legal consequences," the lawyer continued. "Children of that age are highly suggestible, and, let me be clear, she did not identify my client by name. She reacted to a photograph. That is not direct testimony. That is emotion." Judge Harding looked up slowly. "You're accusing the dog of leading the witness?" The courtroom chuckled, but the judge's face stayed stone cold. "No, Your Honor," the attorney replied, lips twitching. "I'm stating that the dog creates a biasing environment. It projects safety, trust, and authority, all under the umbrella of law enforcement. A toddler sitting next to a police dog will say anything to please the adults in the room." Ada Morris stood. "Your Honor, the defense is reaching. Max has no badge. No handler issued commands. No one in this courtroom told Lily to say anything. Her words came unscripted, from her own memory." The judge leaned forward. "And let's not forget, Counselor, your client is pictured at the same daycare where the child claims she was locked in a closet. We're no longer dealing with abstraction. This is a convergence of physical evidence and verbal testimony, rare in cases like this, and more than enough for a jury." The defense. Attorney opened his mouth but didn't speak. There wasn't much left to say. The judge turned to Morris. "Proceed." Jenna Morris took a moment. Then she walked across the courtroom and knelt beside Lily again. The girl sat with Max at her feet, legs swinging slightly under the bench. This time she didn't seem nervous. "Hi again, Lily," Jenna said softly. "I know it's hard to talk. You're being very brave." Lily looked up and said, "Max makes it easy." Jenna smiled gently. "Can you tell us, did you ever see that man again after the closet?" Lily nodded. "Once, at the window." Jenna's brow furrowed. "What window?" Lily pointed. "My old room he looked in." A chill ran through the courtroom. Jenna blinked. "You're saying he came to your house?" Lily nodded again. "At night, before Max." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even the judge stiffened. Jenna turned to the prosecution table and nodded at her paralegal, who immediately typed a note and handed it to a bailiff. "We'll be requesting surveillance pulls from the child's prior residence," she said. "Motion for emergency access." Judge Harding gave a curt nod. "Granted." Granger sat motionless, but his jaw was tight, the tips of his ears red. The image was forming now, not just of a predator hiding behind smiles and community service, but of one who had circled back to silence the only witness. And she had remembered. Because of a dog. Because of a moment no adult could force or fake. As the day adjourned, the prosecution knew what had to happen next. They had to follow Lily's memory all the way back to where the darkness started. And Max? He was still lying at her feet, calm as ever, a four-legged shield standing between a little girl and the man who thought she'd never speak. That night, the courthouse felt like it was breathing, doors whispering closed, footsteps echoing in halls too big for this kind of case. Somewhere down the street, protesters held up signs with a photo of Lily's face and the words, "Let her voice be heard." But inside the district attorney's office, Jenna Morris and Officer Ruiz sat across a long table, both staring at a screen, displaying security footage from Lily's former home. It was grainy, colorless and time-stamped, 1:47 a.m. on March 3rd, 2 weeks before Lily was removed from her parents' custody. "There," Ruiz said suddenly, pointing. Jenna leaned in. Figure had just appeared on screen. At first it was nothing but a shadow by the fence. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately. The man stepped closer to the window, face obscured by a baseball cap. He didn't knock, didn't try to open anything. He just stood there, watching. And then he turned slightly. The porch light flickered. For just a second, the camera caught a reflection. It was faint but unmistakable, a small badge-shaped patch on the man's jacket. "Pause it," Jenna whispered. Ruiz froze the screen. Jenna squinted. "Zoom in." Ruiz did, and the image sharpened. There it was, a K9 volunteer patch. Ruiz swore under his breath. "That's ours." He kept it. After the daycare event, Jenna's stomach turned. He used it to look official. That's how he got close. They were quiet for a moment. Then Ruiz looked at her, eyes narrowed. "You said Max reacted weird when Granger entered the courtroom the first time." "Yeah," Jenna nodded slowly. Ears up, body tense. "I figured he was reading the room." "But dogs don't just read rooms," Ruiz said. "They remember smells." Jenna blinked. "You think Max remembered Granger? He's trained to remember people by scent, especially ones tied to trauma. If Max reacted, it's because he'd seen him before, and not at a picnic." A silence fell between them. Jenna slowly stood. "I want to run a scent match." Ruiz raised an eyebrow. "We don't normally do scent lineups with children's cases." "Then we'll make this one the first." The next morning, back in court, Max was ready. In the hallway outside the courtroom, officers had set up 5 articles of clothing, each sealed in plastic, marked only by a number. Max had been trained to identify a target scent and signal it by sitting in front of the matching item. He sniffed Lily's old bedsheet, a piece pulled from her foster home for the test. Then he began the walk. Article 1, no reaction. Article 2, sniff pass. Article 3, brief pause, no sit. Article 4, Max stopped, sat, didn't move. Officer Ruiz's face went pale. Article 4 belonged to Thomas Granger. It was a hoodie recovered from his home after a warrant had been executed. The E. Night before, Ruiz turned toward Jenna, jaw tight. He was in her room, not just at the window, inside. "How?" Jenna asked, her voice hollow. "Could have been when he was volunteering for the daycare," Ruiz said grimly. "They ran an off-site program for at-risk kids at Lily's house for a few weeks. She was part of it. He had a reason to be there, and access." Jenna didn't speak. "Couldn't. This was no longer a case of circumstantial memory. This was scent-confirmed, timeline-matching physical proof of Granger's presence at multiple scenes." Back in court, Max curled once again beside Lily. She didn't need to talk that day. The evidence was talking for her now. For the first time in the trial, Granger looked afraid, like he knew the walls were closing in, like he realized that the one witness he never counted on, the one he didn't silence, had 4 legs. A memory like fire and the full force of justice behind him. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The gallery held parents, reporters, social workers, even off-duty officers who had heard whispers of what was unfolding. The quiet hum of conversation stopped the moment Judge Harding entered. "Be seated," he said, voice low and sharp. Thomas Granger sat stiffly beside his defense attorney, wearing a suit a size too tight, sweat already beading at his hairline. Gone was the smirk, the confident posture, the friendly volunteer facade. In its place was a man visibly crumbling, because today the scent match would be presented, and with it, a warrant for his past. ADA Jenna Morris stood tall before the jury. She didn't need theatrics. The evidence now spoke louder than any speech. We have physical proof confirmed by trained K9 Max that Thomas Granger was present in the victim's bedroom, a room he had no legal or professional reason to be in. That scent evidence aligns with the victim's own testimony, and we now know that he used his volunteer badge to impersonate law enforcement in the presence of children. She paused and looked at Granger. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Ladies and gentlemen, this wasn't one mistake. This was methodical. It was calculated, and it was repeated. Then she turned to the court officer. Bring in Lily. The door opened. Lily walked in, holding a small stuffed bear in one hand and Max's leash in the other. Max walked beside her, slow and gentle. You could hear hearts breaking as the gallery watched the small girl climb into the witness chair. Not a podium, not a box, just a chair with a booster seat made less intimidating on purpose. She didn't look at Granger. She looked at Max. Jenna crouched beside her. Lily, she said softly, do you remember anything else about the closet? Lily was quiet. The room held its breath. Then she spoke, slow, deliberate. He had a toy, said it was magic. Jenna froze. A toy? Lily nodded. Like a dog with a red light, but not a dog. Granger's head snapped toward her, eyes wide. Lily continued. He pointed it, said it was magic. If I told he'd use it. Jenna's eyes narrowed. Did he point it at you? Lily nodded. It beeped. It beeped when I cried. Gasps filled the room. Ruiz leaned forward from the gallery, whispering to Jenna's assistant. Seconds later, the paralegal handed Jenna a folder, just delivered by police that morning. Inside were photos from Granger's home. Jenna pulled one out and held it up. Lily, is this the magic toy? Lily blinked. Her voice was small, but certain. Yes, it was a dog clicker, a small training device that emits a sharp click sound, commonly used in canine obedience. Granger had one in his bedroom drawer. Jenna stood slowly, turning to the jury. He used a dog training tool to terrify a child, conditioned her like an animal, and it worked, until the day she met a real dog. A dog trained to protect, not control. She turned back to Lily. You don't need to be afraid anymore. Max is here. Lily leaned down and hugged Max tight around his neck. The courtroom was completely silent. Suddenly, Granger stood. Up, she's lying, he shouted, voice cracking. This is all coaching. I was trying to help. Bailiffs rushed in, grabbing his arms. Get your hands off me. She's 3. You can't prove anything. Judge Harding banged his gavel. Sit down, or I'll hold you in contempt. But the damage was done. The mask had cracked, and for the first time the jury saw the real Thomas Granger, desperate, exposed, unraveling before their eyes. As he was led out of the courtroom, the only sound was Lily whispering to Max. He's scared now. Max licked her cheek, and for the first time Lily smiled. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever before. News vans circled the block. Reporters jostled for space on the courthouse steps. Inside, every seat in the gallery was filled, and still, dozens stood along the wall, silent, waiting. Judge Harding sat with a sheet of paper before him, his expression unreadable. To his right, the jury forewoman rose. In the matter of the state versus Thomas Granger, she began, her voice shaking, just enough to betray the gravity of it. On the charge of unlawful entry, we find the defendant guilty. Granger stared blankly ahead. On the charge of impersonating a law enforcement officer, guilty. The gallery leaned forward as if pulled by a string. On the charge of child endangerment, guilty. A murmur ran through the room like a gust of wind. And on the charge of felony child abuse, the woman's voice faltered for only a second. We find the defendant guilty. Gasps, muffled sobs, and one loud exhale. Thomas Granger slumped into his seat. The life drained from his face. His attorney said nothing, his hands folded on the desk as if already surrendering to what came next. Judge Harding gave the nod. Mr. Granger, sentencing will be delivered in 30 days. Until then, you are remanded without bail. Officers, take him into custody. The bailiffs moved fast. As Granger was led away in cuffs, someone from the gallery whispered, Good riddance. But Lily didn't react. She was sitting quietly beside Max, her legs swinging from the padded bench, her little hand resting on the dog's back. Ruiz walked over and knelt next to her. "You did great, kiddo." Lily didn't speak right away. Then she said softly, "Max did great." Ruiz grinned. "That's true. But he couldn't have done it without you." Jenna Morris stood before the courtroom one final time. "Your Honor," she said, "the prosecution would like to make a final statement, not to the court, but for the record." The judge nodded. Jenna turned to the gallery. "This trial began because a little girl pointed at a dog and said 2 words, 'He bad.' Some might have dismissed that. But because someone listened, because a dog reacted and a child remembered, we were able to stop a predator hiding in plain sight." She looked down at Lily. She spoke, and justice listened. The gallery erupted in applause, quiet at first, but growing. Judge Harding let it happen. It was the kind of moment even the law respected. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed to Lily's foster family. They didn't speak, no interviews, no photos, but a single image did make it to the front page of nearly every paper the next morning. Lily hugging Max, her eyes closed, a soft smile on her face, and below the photo, the headline, "The Dog Who Helped Her Speak." 2 months later, Officer Max retired from service. He didn't go to a kennel. He went home. With Lily. Officially adopted by her foster family, who had since begun the process of making her stay permanent, Max lived out his days in a backyard. Full of toys and sun, never more than 10 feet from Lily. She still didn't talk much, but when she did, it was always clear, always confident. And when she began pre-K a year later, her teacher asked her on the first day, "Who's your best friend, Lily?" Smiled and pointed out the window, to the yellow lab lying in the sun. "Max," she said, "he listens better than anyone." And in a way, that's how the world found its newest kind of hero. Not with sirens, not with guns, but with a wagging tail, a steady presence, and the kind of loyalty that even monsters couldn't silence. Because sometimes the loudest voice in a courtroom is the one that doesn't speak at all.